Good afternoon, everyone. This is Ali Mastardo, Senior Association Manager for PPRA. Thank you for joining us today for a webinar on the need for environmental product declarations with a focus on asphalt emulsions. This webinar is being recorded and will be provided via email to all registered attendees. Today, we will hear from Dr. Andrew Bram, the chair of PPRA's Sustainability Committee. Dr. Andrew Bram graduated from the University of Wisconsin with his BS and MS and the University of Illinois with his PhD. He worked for Koch Materials for 2.5 years and performed a postdoc at Southeast University in Nanjing, China. He is currently an associate professor in the Civil Engineering Department at the University of Arkansas, where his teaching and research focus is on asphalt emulsions, pavement maintenance, and rehabilitation and sustainability. If you have any questions during the webinar, please enter them in the question box. Andrew will be answering them as time allows. With that, Andrew, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ali. I appreciate it. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Again, I know some of you are here because you attempted to attend the FHWA webinar, which was back in January. And some of you instead got treated to a compaction webinar, which I'm sure was very important. But if you weren't interested in compaction at that time, you're probably a little disappointed. And so PPRA was gracious enough to offer the opportunity to re-give this presentation with a couple of small tweaks, but just to kind of make sure that everyone who was interested in the content would be able to attend. And as Ali mentioned, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. I may hold off on answering them for a little bit, especially if they're answered a little later on, but I'll be checking it as I go through. So as Ali mentioned, we're going to be talking about EPDs today, an environmental product declaration. Now, you can't really talk about EPDs in a bubble, however. So we're going to actually cover a little wider range of topics, including LCAs, which is life cycle assessment, PCR, product category rules, and that leads to EPDs. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at this through the lens of an asphalt emulsion application. So why are we talking about this today? Well, there are multiple agencies that are moving toward incorporating or even requiring environmental product declarations or EPDs. For example, there is active activity in California and Illinois, and FHWA has been on the cusp of involving EPDs as well. In 2019, there were several pilot projects in the state of California for aggregates, hot mix asphalt, and Portland cement concrete. So this is coming. It just isn't necessarily with asphalt emulsions yet, but it is coming, and California is pretty actively pursuing it. And according to a presentation that was given just pre-COVID, California may require EPDs for a wider range of construction material, potentially including asphalt emulsions, as soon as July 2021. And I scoured the internet looking to see if there was any update on that, and I was not able to find that, but that's definitely something that we're actively monitoring. Now, as I mentioned, EPDs, this is the end product that we're looking for, but it's part of a sequence, and that sequence is a 3-step sequence, and it starts with 1, a life cycle assessment, 2, product category rules, and then 3, the environmental product declaration. So we know EPDs are coming, so what are we going to do as an industry? I'm going to start with a little broad overview of the environmental pillar and what falls under environmental concerns. We're going to then talk about life cycle assessment fundamentals, give you a very brief overview and understanding of what goes into a life cycle assessment, and we'll do the same thing for PCRs or product category rules as well. I'll then cover the basis of environmental product declaration, and throughout all of these steps, I'm going to try and tie concepts and themes to asphalt emulsions. And I've also pulled quite a bit from NAPA, or the National Asphalt Pavement Association's website, because they've done a fantastic job of documenting their experience with LCAs, PCRs, and EPDs. And so that's kind of giving us a very nice template moving forward. So when you talk about sustainability, or at least when I talk about sustainability, I think of 3 pillars of sustainability: the economic pillar, the environmental pillar, and the social pillar. And we are, in this presentation, going to focus primarily on the environmental pillar. And when we think about asphalt emulsions or really any manufactured product, we want to look at 5 pages when thinking about this environmental pillar. And these 5 stages are the raw material acquisition, the material production, the construction, the use of the material, and then finally the end of life of whatever material is being used. And also in addition to these stages, you have the transportation associated with getting from each stage to another stage as well. So this is a nice broad overview of when you're thinking about the environmental pillar of sustainability and when you're thinking about it through the lens of a pavement product, these are the different stages that you want to start thinking about. Now, what are some of the things that can be measured and quantified during these stages? When we start talking about quantifying the environmental pillar, we think about the environmental impact areas. And some ways that we can try and capture the environmental impact is to measure the energy used for the product during all of those life cycle stages that we just reviewed. We could look at the emissions that are generated during all 5 of those life cycle stages. And then we can also look at any sort of solid waste that's generated as well. And solid waste is often broken down into hazardous and non-hazardous waste when thinking about LCAs, PCRs, and EPDs. You're going to see this sequence a lot. The LCA to PCR to EPD, that is one tool that's available. But if you have a deep interest in the environmental pillar, there are other tools out there available. And that includes the ecological footprint, the water footprint, and planet boundary. So if you're interested in the environmental pillar, I encourage you to Google any of those 3 last terms. There's a lot of great information out there available for free online to get an understanding of those tools. But for us, we're going to focus on the LCA, the PCR, and the EPD. So LCA, PCR, EPD, life cycle assessment, product category rule, and environmental product declaration. We're going to start over on the far left, and we're going to move from the left to the right. So starting with the life cycle assessment, this is often broken down into 2 different categories, the LCI and the LCIA. And I'm sure you're all eagerly awaiting the definition of the acronyms LCI and LCIA. And luckily, you won't have to wait long. The LCI stands for Life Cycle Inventory. And during the life cycle inventory, you attempt to compile and quantify the inputs and the outputs of the 5 stages. So if you recall, we'll get there in a minute, the 5 stages are raw material acquisition, material production, construction, use, and end of life. And when we talk about the inputs and outputs of these 5 stages, inputs can include the transportation of any sort of product or materials. It can include the manufacturing of the product or material, and then any sort of maintenance associated with that product or material. Those are all the inputs that go in, so all these different stages. And then the outputs are any sort of fuel or electricity production and use that you use, any sort of waste that's generated, and any sort of emissions. You then take that life cycle inventory and you perform what's called a life cycle impact assessment, or an LCIA. And what an LCIA does is it translates those environmental flows, which were defined in the life cycle inventory, it translates those environmental flows to environment and human impacts. Because at the end of the day, it's a bit esoteric just to say, well, there's, so many tons of CO2 emissions. And while that's nice to have a number, sometimes it's a little difficult to understand what is the impact of that number. And so a life cycle impact assessment takes those environmental flows, takes those numbers, and translates them to actual environmental or human impacts. And so what are some of the impacts? The impacts are depletion of resources, or effects on human health, or effects on the ecosystem. And there's all sorts of categories under the LCIA as well. And that includes energy use, resource use, emissions, toxicity, freshwater use, and hazardous waste. So you can see here we're kind of revolving around and circling around this concept of we have these 5 life cycle stages: the raw material acquisition, the material production, the construction, use, and end of life. We have these inputs and outputs, and those inputs and outputs can then be translated into impacts and categories. So these are all the pieces that we fit together during an LCA in order to continue moving along our trek. So the LCI and the LICA lead to the LCA. So the LCA, if you have trouble falling asleep at night, I highly recommend you download these 2 ISO standards. They are very dense. There's a lot of information in them. They're phenomenal resources, and they are not terribly easy to read. But this is what we follow. So when you hear people talking about life cycle assessments, if they're not following ISO 1440 or 1444, then they're probably not doing a life cycle assessment in a complement way to all of the life cycle assessments that are currently out there. And so ISO 1440 is the life cycle assessment principles and framework, and 1444 is the life cycle assessment requirements and guidelines. And if you break down these 2 documents, you can kind of extract some key steps. And one of those key steps is to determine the system boundaries, which we'll talk about a little bit more. You perform a life cycle assessment inventory and you analyze the data. You then present the results and you perform a sensitivity analysis. Now, I mentioned before that we're going to dive into some examples with asphalt emulsion, and this is going to be the first case where we do this. So how can we look at these key steps, specifically the life cycle assessment inventory and analyzing the data? How can this be applied to asphalt emulsions? Well, this is a great figure of the life cycle of asphalt emulsions, and this is from roadresource.org. And so you can see on the left there, you have 6 different stages of an asphalt emulsion performance, and then you kind of have a graphical representation of each one of those 6 stages as well. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to tie these 6 stages from roadresource.org to the life cycle stages I defined and we've been talking about in this presentation so far. So if we try and look at the life cycle stages, we have the raw material acquisition. And for asphalt emulsions, that includes the asphalt binder, it includes an emulsifying agent, and it includes water. Those are the base materials that are necessary in order to manufacture an asphalt emulsion. And you can also have additives. So you can see a little box of additives in there as well. So that's all the raw material acquisition. You then need to take that raw material and transport it to the plant, transport it to the asphalt emulsion manufacturing facility, and then you produce the asphalt emulsion. So you take your asphalt binder, you take your emulsifying agent and water. The emulsifying agent and water combined is called the soap solution. And then you place those through a colloid mill. After you place those through a colloid mill, you've sheared those asphalt binder droplets into micron sizes that are suspended in the water by the emulsifier, and you place that in a storage tank, so an asphalt emulsion storage tank. So both the colloid mill and the asphalt emulsion storage, those take place at the asphalt emulsion manufacturing facility, and that's a part of the materials production. You then construct with your asphalt emulsion, and this is where things get a little sticky, literally and figuratively. And that's because what we do with the asphalt emulsion varies greatly in our industry. It can be anything from a fog seal, which is simply spraying a potentially diluted product of asphalt emulsion onto a roadway, all the way to what I consider the other end of the spectrum, full depth reclamation, which is kind of the most intense use of asphalt emulsion in the field. We have a huge range of different construction techniques out there, and that directly influences the life of the treatment and then the eventual end of the life of the treatment. So this is all 5 of the stages. But if you recall on the previous slide, we said that we needed to define the system boundary. Well, for asphalt emulsions, we're starting with what's called a cradle to gate. And when you talk about a cradle to gate, you keep the raw material acquisition, you keep the transportation to plant, you keep the material production, but then you stop your analysis at the gate of the asphalt emulsion manufacturing facility. So when we're talking about cradle to grate, our system boundary starts when we take material out of the ground and it ends when that material is loaded onto a truck and driven out of the gate. So we don't include the transportation or the break or the cure. So that means that we're not including the construction and we're not including the end of life. So the LCA for asphalt emulsions and the corresponding EPD will only be a cradle to gate. It will only include the raw material acquisition, the transport to the plant, and then the material production itself. And remember then what we do with this is we look at the energy use, the resource use, and the emissions associated with all of these steps. We look at the toxicity, fresh water use, and any sort of hazardous waste generated with each one of these steps. So there's still a lot to do, but we're stopping at the gate of the asphalt emulsion manufacturing facility. Now, what do we think a potential LCA will look like for asphalt emulsions? And again, we don't know that because we're in the middle of trying to create it, but we can make some pretty educated guesses about what some of the basic content will be. And again, this is coming from looking at the LCA that NAPA performed for the hot mix asphalt, kind of taking some of those concepts that you know will be similar and just translating them over into the world of asphalt emulsions. So we know we have some sort of raw material acquisition. So we know we're going to have to look at asphalt binder, which will include extraction of crude oil, the transportation of that, the refining process, all of that. We know we need water, and usually plants just use city water or municipal water, which means there's some sort of treatment associated with that. We know we're going to have to look at the emulsifier. So this includes if it's a plant-based emulsifier or an animal-based emulsifier, we have to talk about raising that life form and the emissions associated with that and such, the transportation again, and any sort of refining that occurs. And then there's a whole host of additives as well in asphalt emulsions. So if people have nothing else to do this afternoon, we can extend this webinar for a couple hours and we can dig deep into each of these additives. But those can include, for example, polymers, acids, bases, recycling agents, the list goes on. So the list of additives in asphalt emulsions is very long. But the fact is we need to think about all those and account for all of them in our life cycle assessment. So we have all of our raw materials. They have to get taken out of the ground. They have to get taken to some sort of facility. They have to be processed. We then need to take those processed materials and take them to an asphalt emulsion manufacturing facility. So that's the transport of the raw materials to the plant. And then we need to make the asphalt emulsion. So this includes what is the electricity usage, how much natural gas is used, what kind of heating oil is used. Are you on a propane system, a diesel system? All these type of things need to be taken into consideration. After the asphalt emulsion is actually made, we need to store it. We may need to pump it around the plant. We're going to have to mill it, and then you're going to have to load it onto a truck as well. So these are some of the categories that we anticipate being in the life cycle assessment. And as we learn more about the impact of each one of these areas, it will be determined, is that going to be included in the life cycle assessment or is it considered insignificant? But there's a lot going on there. Now, once the LCA is established, we need to start establishing rules. And this is where the PCR comes in. So we're going through this flow of terms, and the PCR again is the product category rule. And the product category rule, once you're done with the other two ISO standards, you can take a look at 1425, and the PCR is defined as a set of specific rules, requirements, and guidelines for developing type 3 environmental declarations for one or more product categories. And what this is kind of the instruction manual saying that you've either produced an LCA or you're in the middle of producing an LCA, But you have to set rules on how are you then going to write the EPD, because the EPD is the end product and it's what a lot of agencies are going to be interested in. So you can't have everyone just writing an EPD however they want. You need to have a set of rules saying that these are the steps you need to go through, these are the categories you need to show, and so on. And so when you start digging into a PCR, there's a lot of information in there. We need to talk about exactly what product category are we defining. And with asphalt emulsion, that's actually a very interesting question. You have to describe that product. You need to talk about what the goal and the scope is, and then what sort of stages are you going to look at. So we've already decided that we're going to look at cradle to gate. We're going to look at the raw material extraction, the transportation to the plant, and then the manufacturing. You then have to dig into the impact categories, the inventory data categories, and the materials and substances to be declared. So this allows any individual facility to say, these are the things that I need to track in order to produce my own EPD. You need to talk about the instructions for producing data, the content, and the format. And this ensures that everyone is collecting data in the same way and they're all presenting it in the same way. And that allows for an easier comparison between two different PCRs, or excuse me, two different EPDs. If they're generated from the same PCR, you can look at those together with a high level of confidence. And then finally, it has a period of validity, and that is 5 years. So a PCR does need to be updated every 5 years in order to ensure that it is as accurate as possible. A third-party review panel is required for PCRs. So unfortunately, I can't just go out and write a PCR and say we now have a PCR. If we did that, we would have to hire a third-party review panel, and they'll come back with a ton of comments. And again, I'm going to harken back to NAPA's website. They actually have that document on their website saying that these are all the comments that the third-party review panel had for the PCR. So it's a great document that's available for anyone to take a look at. Now we're going to take a look at an example for asphalt emulsion again, try and bring some of these concepts to life through the lens of asphalt emulsions. Now again, NAPA, I'm going to say that quite a bit. They have a PCR for asphalt concrete. And so when you think about the inventory analysis, we're just going to look at the transportation. So the NAPA PCR for asphalt concrete led us to believe that we're going to have to think about the transportation from the crude oil well to the refinery. And that includes two-way transportation. You can't just have a truck magically appear at the well to drive it to the refinery. That truck's got to come from somewhere. So you need to have that two-way transportation. And you can rely on what's called on secondary data here. And this is basically saying that we don't need to necessarily go find a truck that's actually driving from a well to a refinery that we know is going to make asphalt emulsion at some point. We can simply take a look at a database that has estimates for if a truck is such a size with so many axles with such a weight, these are the approximate emissions. So that's called secondary data. We're not measuring specific data on a specific truck, but we're using a data set that's accepted by the community, and we can approximate the emissions of that truck based on the distances and the weights that the truck will be traveling and carrying. Now, this is something, the next transportation step from the asphalt binder from the refinery to the emulsion plant, this is actually something that we could potentially use primary data for, because our asphalt emulsion manufacturers have a very good idea of exactly where their asphalt binder came from, because they have to order it. So when they place that order, they know the company that's shipping it, they know that location, they know exactly when it left, they know exactly when it arrived. And so you could actually measure that data if you want to. So this is an opportunity of where we could potentially get some primary data if we desire. But again, we do need to talk then about the two-way transportation. So we get that asphalt binder to the plant. Well, where does that truck go? And that's that two-way part. Now let's do another example of an inventory analysis, and let's look at a plant operation. So this is in an asphalt emulsion manufacturing association. One of the things we're going to have to look at is we need to heat that asphalt binder in the storage tank. We need to heat it up to the 250, 275, 300, 325 degrees Fahrenheit. Whatever that temperature is, we need to make sure it's at the right viscosity so it pumps through the plant correctly and enters the mill at the right temperature. And as I mentioned, we're not only going to have to heat it, but then we're going to actually move not only the asphalt binder, but all the materials through the plant. So there's a bunch of pumps associated with that. There's strainers that need to be accounted for reduced flow, all those type of things. So we're going to have to look at a pretty in-depth examination of the plants and what sort of resources are in them. We have to track what sort of additives are added at the plant and how they're added. So you may bring in a polymer modified asphalt base, or you may add latex in and mill it, or you may post add latex after you've milled the asphalt emulsion. So right there, there's 3 different ways to add polymer into your asphalt emulsion. So we're gonna have to dig into how plants are doing that and what sort of scale are they doing it. And then finally, the milling process itself, of course, takes a tremendous amount of energy. And so taking that soap solution, the water and the emulsifiers, putting it with that asphalt binder, milling it together and putting it into a tank. So these are just a couple of examples, a handful of examples. And if you've ever walked through an asphalt emulsion plant, you could probably go through almost every step you look at and think, oh, wow, we might have to look at this, we might have to look at that. And you can kind of see how we're going to have to piece everything together, making sure that we're capturing all the critical stages and steps. Now, we've also talked about the importance of data quality. LCAs, PCRs, and EPDs are not very good or very useful if you have poor data quality. And so thinking about what we're going to need to identify when we're thinking about asphalt emulsions is, for example, the age of the plant. Newer plants tend to have newer technology. Older plants tend to have older technology. Older plants also may not be quite as efficient because, again, if you've ever been in an asphalt emulsion manufacturing facility, you know they're all different, and you know that some of them have been kind of built over the years, kind of a piece here, a piece over there. And so they're all have their different configurations, but newer plants tend to be a little more streamlined in some of the steps. Not only the age of technology, but also there's a lot of batch plants out there, a lot of continuous plants. Those are 2 very discrete types of technology. Some plants have cooling towers, some don't. So there's a whole bunch of different considerations with what kind of technology is actually in the plants. Obviously, we have a lot of geographic locations. I'm originally from Wisconsin, so I love the cold and the snow. I was, I think, the only person in Fayetteville, Arkansas, who was happy that we had below freezing temperatures and snow on the ground for about a week. I closed my eyes and it almost felt like I was back in Wisconsin, but not quite. But now it's 70 degrees and sunny out, so we're back to normal Arkansas springs. But the point of that little anecdote is that there's a lot of geographic locations, and how we make emulsions down here in Arkansas versus how emulsions are made up in Wisconsin are very different. There's a lot of different considerations to take into account. And then, of course, we need to think about the precision that we're using. So how precise is the data that we're collecting? Is it someone going out to look at a tank board, or do we have digital meters reading measurements? There's a lot of precision questions. There's also some uncertainty. I mean, we could spend years digging apart just one asphalt emulsion plant trying to get all of the specific numbers, but we're going to have to deal with some level of uncertainty. And that kind of goes with the completeness. You know, how much is enough? Is there any sort of cutoff where we don't need to consider a situation or a material at some point? So all these things are important when it comes down to data quality. Now, the format is very important, and it all comes down to units. You want to make sure that everyone's talking in the same unit. So for asphalt emulsions, we may use short tons. For electricity, we may use kilowatt hours. If we're talking about hot oil heaters, and a lot of asphalt emulsion production facilities use hot oil heaters to heat their lines and heat their tanks, you could use MCF or gallons. So millions of cubic feet or gallons. Different ways of quantifying how much hot oil you're using. You could also talk about what sort of residual that you're making with your asphalt emulsion. So what's the percent asphalt binder as the total weight of the asphalt emulsion? We could start taking a look at how much water we're using and how we're using it. So how much is discharged, how much is evaporated. If you have an open soap kettle, is water evaporating as you're making your soap solution? And this list really goes on. This is just kind of a slide to make you start thinking about the possibilities behind all of the different data quality questions that could come up when we're looking at a PCR. And then finally, looking at the environmental aspects, I assume that we'll look at, for example, the global warming potential. So this is a very common metric that's used to track how much CO2 equivalents are produced at a plant. We have stratospheric ozone layer, we have acidification potential, and those both have units of their own, very specific units. We have eutrophication potential and smog formation potential. So these are 5 units that if you go and look at almost any EPD, they'll probably have something either exactly like this or similar to global warming potential, some sort of ozone layer depletion, some sort of acidification, some sort of eutrophication, and some sort of smog formation. So these are very common units that are very common emissions that are used. And one of the reasons it's so common is because you can use the EPA or an Environmental Protection Agency's software called TRACI, T-R-A-C-I. And these are some of the outputs from that software. So that's one of the reasons why they're very common. In addition to the emissions, another thing that we can look at is how we use energy, and this is often in megajoules, but this includes renewable and non-renewable primary energy sources. So are you using energy from a coal power plant? Are you using energy from wood burning, those type of things? And then also, not only as a material, so you have the material that's producing the electricity, but then you also have the energy production itself. So a coal power plant, you need to not only get the coal in order to get the electricity, but then you also need to burn that coal in the power plant. So that's another category of energy that we need to look at as well. And then of course, with some of the more innovative energy sources out there, solar and wind power, there's a whole host of different combinations that can be used. So again, I'm covering kind of a lot of ground quickly here, but it gives you an idea of the type of things you're looking for and the level of detail that's going to be required as we move forward with this. So we've talked about the LCA, we've talked about the PCR, and now we're going to move into the EPDs. So the environmental product declaration, this is the last step in the sequence that we look at as we move through our flow of terms. So environmental product declarations are from 14025. And the goal of this is to provide LCA-based, so life cycle assessment-based, and other environmental information. There's a couple of benefits to this. You can assist purchasers and users, and this means that you can make an informed comparison between 2 different products. It can encourage improvement for environmental performance. If industries and companies are making EPDs, that will incentivize them to make better performing EPDs, lower emissions, lower energy usage, those type of things. And it can also provide information for assessing the environmental impacts of a product over a life cycle. So these are kind of all the objectives and benefits to getting and working toward an EPD. Like a PCR, a third-party review panel is required for an EPD. And when I think of EPDs, I think of MSDSs, material safety data sheets, which are now called SDSs, safety data sheets. Anyone who's shipped a chemical, anyone who's shipped anything these days, you usually need to put an SDS with it. And that is so if something spills during shipping, the people know what sort of safety precautions to take because there's that SDS on the outside of the shipping container. I think of EPDs as a similar label, but instead of for something that's in a box, it's for the environment and it's for a production facility. So EPDs are kind of like an SDS, but not for people, for the environment. And again, why do we need EPDs, or why do we feel like we need EPDs for asphalt emulsions? I had mentioned before, Caltrans in March 2019 was looking at incorporating more construction materials into EPD required materials, and that includes potentially asphalt emulsion. And large states often drive nationwide trends. So this is something that PPRA wants to get ahead of and in front of to make sure that we produce a high quality representative EPD for asphalt emulsions. And digging a little deeper into that, EPDs are required in January 2020 for these materials, including carbon steel, rebar, flat glass, mineral wool, structural steel, those type of things. I mentioned they had pilot projects in 2019 for concrete, asphalt concrete, and aggregates. All of these were facility specific. And I'm going to ask you to kind of file that in the back of your head, that facility specific comment in the back of your head, because I'm going to address that a little more in an upcoming slide. But they did want to, by January 2021, establish a baseline global warming potential, GWP, that will be established for all material. I've not been able to find if they have achieved this yet, but basically this baseline GWP will be the baseline for all construction materials used by Caltrans. And if a material's global warming potential is greater than that GWP baseline, then Caltrans will require an EPD. So this is why we're excited about developing EPDs for asphalt emulsions, because if the global warming potential of asphalt emulsions does exceed this minimum, then we'll have an EPD in our back pocket and ready to go. So going through those steps from 2019, 2021, and then into July 2021, you can kind of see that sequence of the increasing uses of EPDs. So what could an emulsion EPD potentially look like? I assume there'll be some sort of general overview for materials, transport, and production. So this will include resource use from both renewable and non-renewable, both primary and secondary energy sources. There'll also be a section for secondary materials, so things that aren't necessarily produced that go directly into the asphalt emulsion, but are required in order to make the components of asphalt emulsion. Those are the secondary uses. We'll probably also be looking at the net use of fresh water. Some of the output flows that we'll be looking at, disposing of hazardous, non-hazardous, and radioactive waste. You can see there's actually 3 different categories. I mentioned hazardous and non-hazardous before. There's also that 3rd radioactive waste category. We'll take a close look at all the different components and materials for any sort of reuse, recycling, or energy recovery potential. So this might even give us some more insight on things that we could be doing even better. And then what sort of exported electrical and thermal energy there will be as well. So obviously we're generating a lot of heat. That heat is lost over time. There's inefficiencies in the system. So that kind of covers that. And then the results that we'll be looking at will probably include a global warming potential, ozone depletion, acidification, eutrophication, smog. We may also have abiotic depletion and photochemical ozone creation potential. So kind of circling around all those major categories, trying to figure out what will the results actually look at. And you can see an example of the results of an EPD here in the next slide. So NAPA, for one of their asphalt concrete mixtures, has these different parameters. So they have the global warming, ozone depletion, acidification, eutrophication, smog air, and abiotic depletion. So those are the different parameters they have. And you can see they're clearly defined units. And then there'll be a quiz on these numbers. The exact numbers will be required. That's a joke. But you can see here the A1, A2, A3 along the top. That stands for the material extraction, the transport, and then the production of the material. And you can see each parameter has a value for A1, A2, A3. So let's just take a look at that top line there, the global warming potential. Again, this is in kilograms carbon dioxide equivalent. It takes 22.9 kilograms for the material production. It takes 2.34 for the transportation of that material to the hot mix plant, and then it takes 2.86 kilograms of CO2 equivalent for the manufacturing of the asphalt concrete. So you can see right here, something that pops out very quickly is the material extraction and the material processing is a pretty significant portion of this asphalt concrete mix design. And the functional unit is 1 short ton of asphalt mixture. So that means all of these emissions, all these parameters are associated with 1 short ton of asphalt mixture. They could have chosen a half ton, they could have chosen a gram of asphalt mixture. You can choose whatever unit you want, but you have to be very clear on the functional unit and be very consistent with all your data collection with that. And this is actually for a very specific mix as well. It's a dense graded 3/4 inch nominal maximum aggregate size. It has no wrap in it, and it's hot mix. So it's not warm mix or any sort of reduced temperature mix. But you can kind of see all the different possible combinations that could go into just asphalt concrete as well. And that's something that we're very aware of for asphalt emulsions. So moving forward, PPRA believes that establishing an EPD for asphalt emulsion should come first. Again, remember this is a cradle to gate. After we leave that gate, that's when we start looking at all the surface treatments and the rehabilitation treatments, the fog seals, chip seals, microsurfacing, hot in place recycling, cold in place recycling, etc. Then we start looking at all those surface treatments, ultra thin bonded overlays, those type of things. In order to move toward this goal, we established a PPRA sustainability committee in February 2020. So we're just over a year old, and we should have had a birthday party. We didn't have one, but we could have had one since we're just about a year old now. And this is supported by EMA, ERA, and ISSA, so all 3 of the sister organizations. I am the chair of the committee, and Stormy Brewster, who's also on this webinar, she is the co-chair or the vice chair. But she and I have been very fortunate to have 14 highly active, highly engaged members of the committee, and we believe that we've made a lot of good progress. Our first charge is to develop 4 national average EPDs for asphalt emulsion. That's a very important statement. National average EPDs, and we're developing 4 of them, which I'll define in the next slide. And we're working with the company Sphera to develop the LCA, and then we're working with UL Verification Services to develop the PCR. So as I mentioned, we're developing 4 national average EPDs. And we had quite a lengthy discussion about what asphalt emulsions would we look at. Would we look at CRS2P? Would we look at asphalt emulsions for microsurfacing? We decided to kind of take a step back, and this is what the Asphalt Institute did with their asphalt binders. We decided to take a step back, and we're not looking at any grades or reactivities. We're just looking at general categories of asphalt emulsions. So one is a neat asphalt emulsion, just unmodified asphalt binder, and that's it. We're also looking at polymer modified asphalt emulsion. And notice how we're not differentiating between latex or SBS modified. We're just saying is a polymer modified. We're looking at asphalt emulsions with fuel oil, and we're looking at asphalt emulsions with rejuvenators. So these are the 4 types of asphalt emulsions that we're looking at, very broad categories, and we are going to develop 4 EPDs, and they'll be national average EPDs based off of the data we collect. Well, we hope to be done with our LCAs around September 2022, plus or minus 3 months. We hope to be done with our PCRs around November 2022. So you can see here that our PCR development is going to start as we near the end of our LCA development. And then our ideal timeline is to have our EPDs as early as late 2022, but it might be early 2023. So this is kind of the timeline that we're looking at as far as asphalt emulsions go. Now, I've said multiple times that we're going to have site-specific EPDs. And let me just kind of work through this concept a little bit. When I think of sites, when I say site-specific EPDs, that means that you can look at one manufacturing facility and develop an EPD for that. And that is not what we're doing on this first stage. We're looking at a national average EPD. And because there's no existing PCR for asphalt emulsions, this is the sequence that we're going through. We're developing an LCA, we're going to produce a PCR, and we're going to develop our 4 national average EPDs. And what's happening here is the LCA informs a PCR. But then if you look at what NAPA has done, NAPA has written a PCR. And once you have a PCR for a material, you can develop site-specific LCAs and EPDs that can use the PCR that was developed. And NAPA actually has a very slick tool on their website where individual facilities can go in and enter in data and they can develop a site-specific EPD. So when you're talking to people about the sequence of LCAs, PCRs, and EPDs, you usually only start with an LCA if there's no existing PCR. But if your product or your material has a PCR, then you can start with that PCR, perform your own LCA based on the PCR, and develop your own EPD. So that is what we are doing with PPRA, asphalt emulsions, LCAs, PCRs, and EPDs. And I can see that there is a question already, and I apologize, Katie. I saw this question, but I was having a little problem with the functionality, complete user error. So I had trouble expanding the window. So the question that Katie asked is, can you explain further type 3 environmental declarations? Uh, well, thank you, Katie, for the question. And there's kind of more questions in that. But the first part of the question is, can you explain further the type 3 environmental declarations? And I'm not 100% sure how many types there are, but the type 3 environmental declarations that I referred to are talking about EPDs, environmental product declarations. So if we take a look at this slide and we say EPD, we can think of those as a type 3 environmental declaration. Now, Katie goes on to ask, should a full life cycle assessment of the good or service be considered in this EPD type? So for example, why don't we go further than the gate? And Katie, that is a great question. I think from an academic standpoint, I wish we would go further than the gate. I wish we would go from what we call cradle to cradle, which is going through all of the stages of the product and then actually going back to the beginning of the product's life cycle stage. But I think the important thing to think about here is that PPRA is representative of 3 different organizations: Asphalt Emulsion Manufacturing Association, the Asphalt Reclaiming and Recycling Association, and the International Slurry Surfacing Association. And the one common theme between all those 3 organizations is asphalt emulsion. So all 3 of those overlap with the 3 organizations. Now, once you hit that gate, however, the organizations wildly diverge. EMA stops because they've already manufactured the asphalt emulsion, and ARA goes into the hot in place recycling, cold in place recycling, full depth reclamation, and ISA goes off into the surface treatments, the chip seals, the slurry seals, the microsurfacing, the crack treatments, those type of things. So I think all 3 organizations together and the PPRA committee decided, let's start with asphalt emulsions. Once we get a solid LCA, PCR, and EPD for the asphalt emulsions, then we can take a step back and say, what happens after the gate and what do we need to look at? And another important thing to think about with that is a lot of the other EPDs in our industry are also just being developed from cradle to gate, because there are a lot more variables once it goes out of that gate. Then you're getting into specific construction techniques, specific equipment that's being used to construct the treatments, all those type of things. So the permeations just kind of explode outwards. So I apologize, Katie, I'm kind of rambling here a little bit, but the EPDs, this is the first step of potentially a very long process of eventually getting to asphalt emulsion treatment-based EPDs. But a very important first step is getting a key material component, the asphalt emulsion, clearly understood and defined. And then we can start saying, well, what if we start adding virgin aggregate? What if we use in-place material and those type of things? So that's kind of a long-winded answer, but I hope that helped. And so far, that's the only question that's been posted. I noticed Kevin McGlumphy, he is completely engaged. He doesn't have a little triangle. So Kevin, you don't have any questions?
Well, thank you again, Andrew. Really appreciate you taking some time out of your day for this webinar. This webinar was recorded, and we will be sending it out to all registered attendees, as well as it will be posted on our website for anyone to review it at a later time. With that, thank you again, Andrew, and I hope everyone has a great day.